Hello and welcome to Illuminations with Tina and Fee. I'm Tina, and as this is our guest episode for our series on compassion, Fee's not here today, but instead I've got author and blogger Hannah Braime with me. Welcome, Hannah.
Hi, Tina. Thanks so much for having me.
It's really lovely to have you here. Hannah, usually we start these guest episodes with asking our guests to introduce themselves to our audience. What would you like to say about you?
Oh gosh. Well, I run Becoming Who You Are, which you can find at becomingwhoyouare.net, and I've been doing that for a few years now. And Becoming Who You Are is basically it's a blog with lots of tools and resources, as the name suggests, about becoming who you are. So I talk about a wide range of topics there, like compassion, self-kindness, boundaries, but all topics around living as our authentic selves.
Brilliant. And I've obviously been there having a peek, and you do podcasts,
Yes.
you do courses, you've got a great blog there. So as you said, lots and lots of resources there.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you for mentioning that. I have a couple of books as well.
Yes, you do indeed. I've got one of them here, which incidentally is one of my nuggets this month, From Coping to Thriving, which is about self-care and self-kindness. And then you've written a book about journaling as well. Is it The Ultimate Guide to Journaling? Or
Yeah, that's right.
Brilliant. Excellent. So, compassion. We've been exploring that with Fee this month. What's your take on what compassion is?
So my favorite definition of compassion that I've heard, obviously it's one of those words where there's lots of different interpretations of it, and there's quite a broad spectrum of what it could mean. And, you know, it's a fairly subjective word. In some ways it can mean different things to different people. But I think my favorite definition of it comes from the book Self-Compassion by Kristen Neff. Have you read that?
I haven't actually. We've talked a lot about her and her website, but I haven't read that. No.
Okay, well, it's a great book, and if anyone who's watching this is interested in the topic of self-compassion in particular, I highly recommend it, because she unpacks the topic and exactly what it is, and gives lots of really good exercises as well. But she basically says that self-compassion, or compassion and self-compassion, are made up of three main things. There's mindfulness, so being aware of how we're feeling, or that might also be in the context of compassion towards other people. It might be an awareness of how other people are feeling, and with that comes an openness. So, you know, as we all know, we're all human. Life is not always generating positive feelings within us, and so that's being open to suffering, as well as being open to joy, whether that's suffering in ourselves or suffering in other people. And any other emotions that we might actually feel a little bit uncomfortable with. A really key part of compassion is being open to feeling all the feelings, you know, whether it's joy, pain, suffering, disappointment, you know, guilt, shame, you know, all those things that for some of us, or for most of us, I would say, are probably quite uncomfortable and maybe we try and avoid sometimes.
Yes.
So that's the first component of it, is mindfulness, being aware of how we're feeling or how other people are feeling. The second part is an awareness of our shared humanity, right? She says in the book that if you break down the word compassion and look at the Latin root of it, passion is suffering and com is with. So compassion is suffering with. And that doesn't mean that we're all kind of going through life like, oh, it's so awful, and you know, it's a real drag. And but it does mean that, as I said, you know, suffering is a part of life. And I think it's Brené Brown who points out that, you know, we can't selectively feel things. We can't just pick and choose which feelings we have. And so if we try and numb ourselves to uncomfortable feelings, we're also going to be numbing ourselves to joy and excitement and, you know, love and all the things that we really yearn to feel a lot of the time. And so one of the great things about compassion is that there is a sense of, you know, shared experience there, that even if someone is experiencing a feeling because of a situation that we have never experienced ourselves, we can at least relate to that feeling on a human level, because chances are we have experienced that feeling ourselves, right? Even if we haven't experienced the same situation that's caused it. And so although, you know, the translation suffering with sounds a little bit heavy, there's actually a really nice message in there, which is that this is, you know, all these experiences are things that tie us together. They connect us as people. And so that's another component of it, is this this awareness that we are, you know, we're all connected by our suffering. You know, we're all connected by these shared human experiences. And then the third part is self-kindness, right? And this might be kindness towards other people as well. And, you know, when I think about kindness, Kristen Neff, I don't think explicitly says this, but when I think about self-kindness, because self-kindness is something I talk a lot on Becoming Who You Are, I'm very careful to differentiate between being kind and being nice, right? Being kind doesn't always mean the same thing as being nice. And I think that's something that we can conflate in our minds sometimes, right? But self-kindness is basically wanting the best for ourselves. Even though it might not be very comfortable in the short term, it might mean doing things that perhaps we don't really feel like doing in the moment, or, you know, feel a little bit uncomfortable. And equally, kindness towards other people is the same, right? Sometimes the kindest thing to do is to have a really difficult conversation with someone that they might not really want to have at that time. But doing that is kinder than not saying anything at all. You know, that's just one example. But yeah, she talks about it in terms of that triad. And that's probably my favorite definition of it.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, we've talked about that triad as well when we explored it with Fee. And one of the words that we used a lot when we talked about it was non-judgment. To kind of when we look up on another person and their pain or their suffering, and we connect into that we do it without any judgment.
Absolutely.
And that we also talked about that can be hard sometimes not to
absolutely judge. I mean, this is the interesting thing about non-judgment. I know it's a very, you know, I've studied person-centered counseling, and non-judgment or unconditional positive regard is a huge part of that. And, you know, it's interesting because it is a real challenge, because we are inherently judgmental as human beings. And sometimes it's really helpful, right? If we're in a dangerous situation, or, you know, a situation that sort of gets our internal GPS, our intuition going, we want to be judgmental because it's in our best interest to be so. But as you rightly said, you know, I think there's something really important about having that mindfulness again, and being aware of, oh, you know, I'm having a judgment right now, but I don't necessarily need to communicate this. My judgment might not even be correct, right?
Exactly.
And that goes as much for ourselves as for other people. I mean, you know, goodness knows we probably have more judgments about ourselves than we do about other people often.
Absolutely. I agree. So that's what compassion is. What is compassion not?
This is a topic that I think is really important to talk about, as well as what it is. I think for, you know, when people hear about self-compassion and related terms like self-love and self-care, and, you know, in the context of relationships with other people, you know, having loving care for other people, I think sometimes, especially when it comes to ourselves, it can get conflated with things like self-indulgence, or, you know, being kind of flaky. You know, self-love to a lot of people, myself included, I don't use that term very much because it sounds a little bit sort of woo-woo, you know. Even though I think it is really, really important, you know, I prefer to talk about things like acceptance, non-judgment, as you just said, you know, that level of things. But yeah, I think there is this misunderstanding that, you know, compassion is just, in the context of our relationship with other people, is just sort of accepting everything, right, without, or having no boundaries. That's a better way to put it, right? I think compassion, as I just talked about with kindness, compassion has to come with integrity. It has to come with boundaries, and that means that, you know, we might experience someone saying or doing something to us that is hurtful or crosses the line as far as we're concerned in terms of our own personal values and relationships. And sometimes it can be a little bit of a tricky thing, which is, how do I show compassion to this person, but also take care of myself, right? And that's a tightrope I think we're all walking all the time. And it's a movable tightrope as well, you know, especially in the trickiest, most complicated relationships and situations in life. But that's probably, you know, one of the main things I would say is that compassion is not just accepting all behaviors and, you know, anything that anyone says to you and just sort of letting people walk all over you. You know, it definitely, the right kind of compassion definitely comes with a regard for yourself as well as for other people. And arguably it's very hard to have proper regard for other people if you don't have it for yourself as well.
Absolutely, of course. So what, we've kind of touched upon this already, but if we talk about real, authentic compassion, so what does that look, feel, and sound like?
That's a great question. I think it really depends on the context and the situation. Speaking in general terms, um, for me anyway, and I'm definitely not I wouldn't chalk myself up as an expert on this. It's something I've done a lot of thinking about and a lot of reading up on, and talking about with people, and coaching, etc. For me, and I say the caveat that it might look different for someone else, because we all get to choose what it looks like to us. For me, I think it's that balance that I just talked about, being open to my feelings, all of them, to other people's feelings, the whole spectrum, and holding that balance between supporting someone else, being kind to someone else, reaching what they're bringing with, non-judgment, and it's not always easy, right? It doesn't always happen, but with non-judgment, with those qualities that we just talked about, but also being aware of my own feelings. So like I just said, if I have a judgment, being aware, oh, this is the judgment I'm having. There's a really nice phrase Brené Brown uses, and I bring up Brené Brown again, I love her work. I think it's really, really helpful, even though she doesn't directly talk about compassion. A lot of these topics that we're discussing, like boundaries and everything, is so interrelated, and vulnerability is her big thing. And so that's why I keep referencing her. But she talks about using this really lovely phrase, which is the story I'm telling myself is, right? So having that awareness in my head of, okay, this person is saying X or doing X, I feel this, and then trying to put myself in their shoes as well. Like there's another phrase I really like called that is assume the best. And so being aware of when I might be jumping to conclusions about someone, judging them, putting myself in their shoes, and just being open to what they're bringing, without necessarily needing to fix it or to change it or to quote do something about it. I think quite often compassion is it's just about being more than doing. I'm not sure if that answers your question, because it's such a kind of,
I know,
it could look like so many different things in different situations. So I feel like I've sort of merged a whole bunch of different different contexts in one there.
It does answer it. So you have come to the Brené Brown fan club.
Oh, brilliant.
we tend to reference her, at least 70% of the episodes of Illumination. So absolutely. So one last question then. If we had more compassion and self-compassion in our world, what changes, or what would the world look like, or how would it be different, do you think?
Gosh, that's another great question.
It's a big one.
Yeah, I know. I'm going to need a minute just to think about this. I think the first thing that comes to mind is I wrote a post on my blog years ago now, but it's one of these posts that I need to go back to quite a lot just for myself, which is about responding, not reacting. I think, again, when we're in challenging situations, when we're perhaps feeling a bit under the weather or frazzled or stressed, when somebody does something that we don't like, we can react to things. We can have these sort of knee-jerk reactions, and usually when we react in that way, we're not really acting as our best selves. When we look back on it, we might have feelings of regret about the way we acted, but not showing up in usually the ideal way that we want to show up in. I think if we could approach these situations with greater self-compassion and greater compassion for other people, I think we'd be more likely to respond, which is to give a more considered response, which is more in alignment with who we want to be, which is being mindful of the values that we want to embody in the world. So that's one aspect of it. I think particularly when it comes to self-compassion, a question I really liked to ask my coaching clients is, if you had just 5% more kindness or compassion towards yourself, what would you do differently? Because 5% is doable, right? Sometimes, as I said earlier, I think terms like self-love can feel like a bit of a high bar for people. I know they certainly do for me. During those times when I'm not feeling so self-loving, it can feel like it's a really big milestone that's just too high. But just 5% is totally doable, and wherever we are, we can always kind of notch it up a little bit. But I think if we could all just experience even that 5%, we would create more. We'd be more willing to share ourselves fully with other people. We'd have richer connections with other people. I hope we'd all get on a little bit better as well. I know that conflict is important in relationships, but I hope that we would fight a little bit more kindly, and a little bit more constructively as well. In general, both in our interpersonal relationships and thinking about, the global context, the world as we're in it at the moment, and some of the things that are happening. I would hope that we'd be less divided as cultures, as people. That's a great question. Honestly, I'm not sure. I hope it happens at some point.
Yeah.
And certainly that's I'm sure, as with you, that's part of my hope, is that if there's just one person who can come away from reading my blog with that 5% more self-compassion or compassion for other people, that's really good. That's kind of why I'm doing it.
Yeah.
So yeah, well, I'm curious to hear from you. What do you think the world would be like if we all had more compassion or self-compassion? Or more compassion and self-compassion, I should say.
Well, I think it would be a much kinder place. I think there would be more joy, definitely, and more love for ourselves and for others. And I think, with compassion, the self-kindness bit there with self-compassion is just when we have self-kindness and self-care and good boundaries, when we feel good, we are so much more able to help others feel good and treat others with kindness and with compassion. So I think that if we kind of start with ourselves, we have much more to give, So, yeah,
definitely.
We could talk about that for hours, I'm sure.
Yeah. A thought that struck me, if you don't mind me just jumping in as you were talking, is that, the great thing about this is that we don't live in a world where everyone is, 100% self-compassionate or compassionate towards other people yet. But this is something, when we're feeling kind of disempowered by things that are happening around us, or a little bit kind of out of control about other things that are happening in our lives or in the world, this is something where we can affect change, in our own personal little bubbles, right? If we can work on our own self-compassion and our own compassion towards other people, we don't need other people around us to change necessarily. We can be that change ourselves, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I think sometimes it's the hardest thing is to show self-compassion, because as we said earlier, we judge ourselves very harshly sometimes. But also sometimes I feel that sometimes it's easier for me to be compassionate to somebody out there on the street than my own mother. And if I can find that compassion for my mum, for example, because I love my mum, she's fantastic, but daughter-mum relationships, and so yeah, starting at home is a good place to kind of practice it.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and it's often the hardest in those relationships that are closest, whether biologically closest, with a lot of history, or partners, children, siblings, whatever the case might be. It's really, really good, really old friends. Those relationships with really entrenched dynamics are often, they are the hardest sometimes to feel compassionate, even though they are the most important relationships to us in many instances.
Exactly. Hannah, it's been wonderful talking to you. We're out of time. So can you remind us again where we can find you?
Yes, you can find my website at becomingwhoyouare.net.
Brilliant. And for those of you who've enjoyed this episode, please do share it with others. Leave us a comment with anything you'd like to ask us or share with us about compassion. And we will see you next time. Take care.
Thanks a lot for having me.
Bye.